The room had already decided what it was seeing before Eleanor Graves could draw a full breath. She stood in the doorway of Sir Alderton's library with her hair loosened at one temple where the shelf had caught it. A volume of Cowper pressed flat against her bodice, and behind her, close enough that his shadow fell across her shoulder, Lord Ashworth, Marquis of Highfield, stood with one hand still raised toward the book she had already taken down. The silence in the corridor was immediate and total. Mrs. Langford's fan stopped mid-arc. Sir Alderton's wife pressed her gloved fingers to her collarbone as though absorbing a blow. The footman carrying a tray of claret glasses slowed and then stopped, the glasses trembling once against the silver, and in that held breath, in that corridor where the candles guttered and then steadied. Every guest within earshot performed the arithmetic of a young woman alone with an unmarried marquis in a closed room at 10:30 in the evening, and arrived at the only sum the season would permit. Eleanor felt the heat climb her throat and settle behind her ears. She opened her mouth to explain that Lady Fenton had asked for the Cowper, that Lord Ashworth had already been in the library when she entered, that the door had not been shut so much as pulled by the draught from the terrace windows. She opened her mouth, and Lord Ashworth spoke first. "Miss Graves and I are engaged," he said. His voice carried no warmth. It carried no hesitation. It carried the particular authority of a man whose rank made contradiction unthinkable, and it landed in the corridor like a stone dropped into still water, and every ripple that followed moved outward from that single declarative sentence as though it had always been the truth. Eleanor's fingers tightened on the book's spine until she felt the pressed cloth bite her palm. She did not look at him. She looked at Mrs. Langford's fan, which had resumed its motion with a new and eager rhythm, and at the footman, who had begun walking again, and at the corridor itself, which had rearranged its understanding of her in the space of 9 words, and she felt the ground beneath her shift in a way she could not yet name. His hand found her elbow. She had not expected it. His fingers were warm through the fabric of her sleeve, steady and deliberate, and the touch lasted exactly long enough to guide her one step forward into the corridor before it withdrew. She did not look at him. She felt the place where his hand had been as a line of heat on her skin that did not fade for the rest of the evening. If you have ever watched a woman hold perfectly still while the world reshapes itself around a sentence she did not author, you know the particular quality of Eleanor's composure in that corridor. Stay close. She had come to Highfield Park in the autumn, 8 months before Sir Alderton's dinner, and 4 months after the discovery that the Reverend Dr. Graves had left not a legacy, but a debt of £400 secured against a house that no longer belonged to her. Eleanor was 23 years old. She owned 6 dresses, 2 of which had been rehemmed so many times the fabric at the seams had gone translucent. She owned a winter cloak with a mended lining and a tear at the left cuff she disguised by folding. She owned a pair of gray gloves she had restitched twice at the left thumb, and she owned a small leather-bound volume of her mother's verse, the pages foxed and soft with handling, with violets pressed between the leaves so old they had gone the color of ash and crumbled if touched with anything heavier than breath. Her mother had placed them there 20 years before, the spring before she died. The book smelled of lavender and old paper, and Eleanor carried it the way another woman might carry a portrait or a ring. Lady Fenton, Lord Ashworth's maternal aunt, had written to Eleanor's godmother in September, offering the position of companion at Highfield Park, and Eleanor had accepted the same afternoon because the alternative was a governess post in Shropshire for a family whose letter had misspelled her name twice in 4 lines. At Highfield, she read aloud to Lady Fenton in the mornings, managed her correspondence in the afternoons, walked with her in the garden when the weather held, and sat with her in the evenings while the old woman dozed and the fire settled into coals. She occupied a room on the 3rd floor that looked out over the east lawn and the lake beyond it, a room with clean linen and a cold draft under the door, and a writing desk whose drawer stuck unless she lifted the handle while pulling. She was fed. She was housed. She was, in the estimation of the household and the county, the companion, and the word carried the particular weight the season assigned to women who worked in proximity to wealth without possessing any. A companion was not a servant. A companion was not a guest. A companion was the woman whose presence confirmed, by contrast, the rank of everyone else in the room. Lady Ashworth, Lord Ashworth's mother, had made the hierarchy explicit on Eleanor's second day. She had come into Lady Fenton's sitting room to discuss the week's menus and had addressed Eleanor without once looking at her face. "The companion will take her meals in the morning room with the housekeeper," she said to Mrs. Dalton. The housekeeper, as though Eleanor were a piece of furniture whose placement required instruction. "There is no need for her at the family table. I trust that is understood." Eleanor had said nothing. She had folded her hands in her lap and felt the ridge of the mended glove against her knuckle, and understood that in this house, as in the world that surrounded it, her function had become her name. She was the companion. She was not Eleanor Graves, daughter of Dr. Graves of Hartwell, who had read Latin at 12 and French at 14, and who had once played the piano at the Midsummer Assembly with such steadiness that the room had gone quiet for reasons that had nothing to do with politeness. She was the companion. The house had decided, and the house did not revisit its decisions. Lord Ashworth himself she had seen rarely in those first months, and always at a distance that propriety maintained without effort. He was 31, unmarried, and possessed of the kind of stillness that the county read as coldness, and that Eleanor, who had spent her childhood watching her father minister to grief-stricken parishioners, read as something held rather than something absent. His jaw was set in the way of a man who kept his face deliberately composed, and his eyes, which were the gray of winter river water, moved across a room with a specificity that suggested he catalogued more than he acknowledged. He spoke in short sentences. He issued commands where other men offered invitations. He had never, in Eleanor's careful peripheral observation across 8 months of shared breakfasts and chance encounters in corridors, raised his voice, and he had never softened it, and the consistency of that register had begun to occupy more of her attention than she could justify to herself. She noticed that he entered a room the way some men approached a negotiation, assessing before committing. She noticed that his posture changed when his mother spoke of marriage prospects, a tightening along the shoulders so slight it was visible only to someone who had been watching for it, which Eleanor had not meant to be doing. She noticed these things and set them aside, and did not permit them to mean what they were beginning to mean. On the evening of Sir Alderton's dinner, the fiction of their engagement settled into the county's understanding with the swiftness of weather moving across open land. By the time the carriages were called, Mrs. Langford had told 4 women in the cloakroom. By the following morning, the vicar's wife had carried it to the village. By noon, the county had accepted it as the season's only interesting development, and by the following afternoon, when Eleanor sat in Lady Fenton's room with the cowper open on her lap, and her pulse still not quite steady from the previous evening, Lady Ashworth swept into the room with her chin raised and her gloves still on, and her stride carrying the focused energy of a woman who has found a purpose where she expected an obstacle. 3 weeks, Lady Ashworth said. She stood by the fireplace and did not sit down. The wedding will take place at St. Michael's on the 22nd of December. I have written to the bishop's office. I have spoken with Mrs. Dalton about the arrangements. The banns will be read on Sunday. The linen is being aired. Eleanor's hands went still on the page. She looked at Lady Fenton, who blinked with the slow bewilderment of a woman woken from a nap into a new century, and then at Lady Ashworth, whose expression held neither pleasure nor warmth, but the focused satisfaction of a woman who had finally found a use for an inconvenient situation. The engagement was a lie. It had been a lie spoken to protect Eleanor's reputation and Lord Ashworth's name in a corridor that would not have forgiven either of them for the truth, and the understanding between them, communicated in a single exchanged look after the guests had gone, was that the fiction would be dissolved quietly after the season turned. A broken engagement was survivable for a marquess. A ruined companion was not survivable for anyone. That had been the arithmetic. Lady Ashworth had replaced it with her own. She had set the date, ordered the banns, and begun planning a wedding for a bride she considered beneath notice, because even a companion was preferable to another season of her son's refusal to marry. Lord Ashworth found Eleanor in the garden that afternoon. She was walking the gravel path along the east border, her cloak pulled tight against the November air, and her shoes, which had worn at the heels so that she felt every stone through the leather, pressing into the frost-hardened ground. He fell into step beside her without greeting. His stride shortened to match hers, and the adjustment was so precise that she heard it in the change of rhythm on the gravel. "You heard," Eleanor said. "I heard." He did not look at her. He looked at the path, at the bare hawthorn hedge, at the lake beyond the lawn where the surface had gone the color of pewter under the low sky. A single heron stood at the water's edge, still as a carved thing. "Your mother has set a date." "She has. And you intend to correct her." He was quiet for 4 strides. 5. The gravel crunched under his boots, and the sound was the only warmth in the garden. "Not yet," he said. Eleanor stopped walking. She turned to face him, and the wind caught the edge of her cloak and pressed it flat against her ribs. And she was aware, with a precision that startled her, of exactly how near he stood. Near enough that she could see the pulse at the hinge of his jaw. Near enough that the warmth of his body reached her through the cold November air, like a hand held close to a candle flame. "Lord Ashworth." "The correction requires timing," he said. His voice was level and unhurried, and his eyes moved to hers and held. "My mother will accept a dissolution after the season, when the county has moved to other gossip, and the corridor at Sir Alderton's has been replaced by fresher scandal. She will not accept one now, 3 days after the announcement, when a retraction would confirm every suspicion the evening produced. A dissolution now makes you a schemer who overreached. A dissolution in January makes you a woman who reconsidered a match that was never quite right. The county will accept the second. It will not forgive the first." His jaw tightened. The wind pressed his coat against his frame, and Eleanor could see, in the set of his shoulders and the deliberate steadiness of his breathing, the effort the explanation cost him. "You will not be made a schemer, Miss Graves. Not in my house." It was a command dressed as an explanation. It was framed as reason and delivered as protection. Eleanor heard only the command, and the warmth behind her ears, which she attributed to the wind, did not subside for the rest of the walk. They reached the terrace steps. The stone was dark with damp, and the house rose above them with its windows lit against the coming evening. "Come inside," he said. "You are cold, and you have not eaten since breakfast." She was not cold. She was aware of every nerve in her body and of the exact distance between his hand and hers on the stone railing. She followed him inside, and the warmth of the entrance hall settled against her face and throat, and she pressed her fingertips to the binding of the book she still carried, as though it could tell her what to do with the fact that her heart was beating in her throat and her chest and her wrists all at once. The following Tuesday, Eleanor sat in Lady Fenton's room reading Wordsworth aloud, while the old woman dozed in the armchair by the fire. The afternoon light through the window was thin and gray, making the room feel smaller and warmer than it was, and Eleanor read slowly, matching her cadence to the rhythm of Lady Fenton's breathing, pausing when the old woman stirred and resuming when she settled. She smoothed the blanket where it had slipped from Lady Fenton's knee. She poured water from the pitcher on the side table and set it within easy reach. She turned the page, and the paper whispered against her fingers. And she kept reading. She did not hear the door open 2 inches further on its hinge. She did not see Lord Ashworth standing in the corridor, with one hand on the frame and his shoulder against the wall, watching through the gap. He stood there for 7 minutes. She adjusted the blanket again. She held Lady Fenton's hand when the old woman reached for hers in sleep, and her voice did not falter, and her posture did not shift, and the tenderness in her attention was not performed for anyone. It was simply the way she was in a room when she believed herself unobserved. Lord Ashworth turned and walked toward the staircase. His face, as always, gave nothing to the house. His hands, deep in the pockets of his coat, were not steady. Miss Cecilia Pembroke arrived at Highfield Park the following afternoon, installed in the blue guest room by Lady Ashworth's personal instruction, and with a trunk of gowns that took 2 footmen to carry up the stairs. She was 20, fair-haired, accomplished in French and watercolors, and possessed of the kind of beauty that rooms organize themselves around without being asked. Her father was a baronet with £6,000 a year and a house in Grosvenor Square, and Lady Ashworth had spent the previous 2 seasons steering her son's attention toward this woman with the focused patience of a gardener training a vine toward the only wall that received the sun. At tea that afternoon, Lady Ashworth sat in the drawing-room between Cecilia and Eleanor and addressed the room as though arranging a demonstration. "Miss Pembroke has been studying the harp with Maestro Rinaldi in Bath," she said, turning the full warmth of her voice toward Cecilia. She performed at Lady Thornton's reception in the spring and received 3 invitations on the strength of it. She turned to Eleanor, and the warmth withdrew like a curtain pulled shut. "The companion might pour the tea. Mrs. Dalton seems occupied." The word landed in the drawing-room like a coin dropped on marble, sharp and bright and ringing. Cecilia looked at her teacup with an expression that was not quite comfortable. Mrs. Dalton, standing at the sideboard and not occupied at all, looked at the wall above the window. Eleanor rose and poured, and her hand did not tremble, and her face held the steady, neutral composure she had perfected across 8 months of being named by her function, and the effort of that composure settled into her shoulders like a weight she would carry for the rest of the afternoon. The days compressed around the fiction. The engagement required performance, and Eleanor and Lord Ashworth performed it, with the careful precision of 2 people learning the steps of a dance neither had chosen. They walked together in the garden where the household could observe them through the morning-room windows. They sat beside each other at dinner, where Lady Ashworth could measure the distance between their elbows. They attended church on Sunday, where the banns were read aloud, and Eleanor heard her own name paired with his in the vicar's steady voice, and felt the wooden pew beneath her fingers go strange and distant, as though it belonged to someone else's life. She sat through the reading with her hands folded and her pulse high in her throat, and the awareness that the man beside her had not flinched when the vicar spoke, had not shifted, had simply sat with his hands on his knees and his face forward and the same composure he brought to everything. And she did not know what that stillness meant, and the not knowing had begun to keep her awake past midnight. Beneath the surface of the performance, in the space where words had not yet found permission, something accumulated. She noticed that he always positioned himself between her and the nearest door, so that anyone entering a room would encounter him before reaching her. She noticed that when Lady Ashworth's voice sharpened in Eleanor's direction across the breakfast table, his jaw tightened by a fraction so small it would have been invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. And Eleanor was looking for it, and she could not explain to herself why. And the inability to explain had become its own kind of weight. She noticed that his hand, when he helped her from the carriage after church, held hers for precisely 1 second longer than the function required, and that second lived in her palm for the rest of the afternoon, like warmth from a stone that had been sitting in the sun. She carried it. She did not name it. On the Tuesday evening, passing the door to the blue guest room on her way to Lady Fenton's chamber, Eleanor heard Cecilia Pembroke's voice through the gap. She was speaking to her maid, and the words were not unkind, and they were not whispered, and they carried the particular clarity of a woman who did not consider the hallway occupied. "It is only the companion, after all," Cecilia said. "Lady Ashworth says the whole arrangement will be undone by January. She says the companion does not even have a proper dress for the ceremony." The maid murmured something Eleanor could not hear. Cecilia's voice continued, patient and factual, as though reporting the weather. "I feel sorry for her, truly. She seems decent enough. It is simply not her world." Eleanor stood in the corridor with her hand on the wall and let the words settle into the place where the others had settled. Beside the companion will take her meals in the morning room, and the companion might pour the tea, and the weight of the three together was heavier than anyone alone. And she pressed her palm flat against the plaster and breathed once and continued walking. On the Wednesday before the wedding date Lady Ashworth had set, Lord Ashworth came to find her in the library after the house had gone quiet. She was sitting in the window seat with her mother's book of verse open on her knee, the pressed violets visible between the pages in the last of the evening light, their color nearly gone. He stood by the mantel and looked at the fire. He did not sit. "My brother drowned in the lake," he said. His voice was level and did not waver, and Eleanor understood from the quality of its steadiness that the words had been rehearsed, not because they were false, because they were the kind of truth that required preparation. "William, he was 10 years old. I was 20, and I was sitting in this room, at that desk, reading a letter that could have waited, when he went to the water alone. The groundskeeper found him at dusk." The fire shifted in the grate. A log collapsed, and the sparks rose and died, and the silence that followed his words was the kind that does not ask to be filled. Eleanor closed the book of verse and held it in both hands against her lap. "I have spent 11 years believing that the cost of my inattention is that I do not deserve to be trusted with anything that matters," he said. His hands gripped the mantel's edge, and his knuckles had gone white, and Eleanor could see, in the set of his shoulders and the rigid line of his back, the shape of 11 years of carrying a weight that no one in this house had been permitted to see. "I believed it when my mother presented Miss Pembroke. I believed it when the county presented every suitable woman of the last 6 seasons. I believed it steadily and completely, until I stood in a corridor outside my aunt's room and watched you hold her hand while she slept. And something I had locked for 11 years came unlocked, and I have not been able to lock it again." He turned from the fire. His eyes, gray and steady and stripped of every defense this house had seen him wear, met hers across the length of the room. Eleanor's breath caught at the base of her throat. Her pulse beat once, hard, in the hollow beneath her collarbone, and she pressed her fingertips to the violets in the book and felt the dried petals give slightly against her skin. She said nothing. She did not need to say anything. The room held them in the thin winter light, and what moved between them in that silence was not a declaration, and not a confession, and not a lie. It was the thing itself, unspoken and undeniable, and the fire burned lower, and the violets crumbled slightly beneath her touch, and neither of them moved. If this story has found you on a quiet evening, and if Eleanor's patience has earned a small place in your attention, you might leave a like or a comment before the night is through. She is not finished yet. The pre-wedding dinner was held on the Friday, 2 days before the ceremony Lady Ashworth had arranged. The county filled the dining room at Highfield Park. The Langfords were there, seated near the foot of the table. Sir Alderton and his wife occupied the places nearest the fire. The vicar and the vicar's mother, who wore a cameo at her throat and carried disapproval in her posture as naturally as other women carried a fan, sat opposite. Miss Pembroke arrived in a gown of ivory silk that caught every candle in the room and threw the light back as though the fabric itself were making an argument. And Eleanor sat in her gray dress, the one she had rehemmed twice, with her mother's book upstairs on the nightstand and her composure held like water in cupped hands. Lord Ashworth was not there. He had been called away that morning to the solicitor's office in the neighboring county by an urgent letter, and his chair at the head of the table sat empty, and Eleanor sat beside it with the particular stillness of a woman who understands that the only protection she has relied upon has left the room. The first course had not been cleared when Lady Ashworth rose from her chair. She held a letter. Her face was the face of a woman who had found the evidence she had been searching for, and the satisfaction in her expression was cold and clean and final. "I must share something with the company," she said. Her voice carried to every corner of the room. "My son's engagement to Miss Graves is a fabrication. It was spoken in a corridor at Sir Alderton's house to conceal a circumstance that never required concealing. Because there is nothing between my son and the companion that could produce a scandal worth the name." The room went silent. Mrs. Langford's fan stopped. Sir Alderton set down his glass with a click that carried. The vicar's mother pressed her lips together and looked at Eleanor with the expression of a woman who had suspected as much from the beginning. And the word companion fell into that silence with the weight of a sentence delivered from a bench, and every face turned to Eleanor with the particular curiosity of people who have been given permission to see what they had already been thinking. "I had hoped," Lady Ashworth continued, her voice gathering the righteous clarity of a woman defending her house, "that the companion would have the grace to withdraw before the banns were read. She did not. She permitted the fiction to continue, sat at my table, accepted the ring my son placed on her hand, and allowed me to plan a wedding for a woman who has no rightful claim to this family, this house, or this name." Cecilia Pembroke looked at her plate. Her expression was not triumph. It was something closer to discomfort. The face of a woman who had been placed in the final act of a drama she had not auditioned for and did not wish to perform. Eleanor stood. The chair scraped against the floorboards, and the sound was sharp in the silence, and every eye followed her. Her hands were steady at her sides. Her voice, when she found it, was low and clear, and carried the particular weight of a woman who had nothing left to protect, except the truth itself. "The engagement was Lord Ashworth's invention," she said. "He spoke it to prevent my ruin in a corridor that had already decided what it was seeing. I permitted it, because the alternative was a disgrace I had not earned, and could not have survived. I have taken nothing from this house that was not offered freely. I have accepted no gift, no settlement, no jewel, no promise I did not understand to be temporary." She looked at Lady Ashworth. Her eyes were bright, and her chin was raised, and the composure she had carried through 8 months of being called the companion was still holding, and it was costing her everything she had. "I will leave Highfield in the morning. I ask only that Lady Fenton be told gently, and that Mrs. Dalton be permitted to help me with my trunk." She turned toward the door. She did not run. She walked with the measured step of a woman who has learned that dignity is the only possession that cannot be seized by creditors, or stripped by season, or spoken away by a woman with a letter in her hand, and the room watched her go, and not one voice in it followed her. The front door opened 9 minutes later. Eleanor heard it from the staircase, where she had stopped with one hand on the banister and the other pressed flat against her ribs as though holding something fractured in place. She heard boots on the marble floor, rapid and deliberate. She heard Mrs. Dalton's voice, low and urgent, and then his stride, which she would have known anywhere. Crossing the entrance hall below her, Lord Ashworth appeared at the bottom of the stairs. His coat was dark with rain. His cravat was loosened from the ride, and water ran from his hair to his collar, and his face held the expression of a man who has understood a situation in the first second of entering a building and has already decided what he will do about it. "Sit down," he said. Eleanor did not sit down. She stood on the 4th step and looked at him, and her eyes were bright. And the composure she had held through the dining room had broken on the staircase where no one could see, and her face showed it, and she did not try to hide it. "Your mother knows," she said. "I am aware." She told them all. The Langfords, the vicar, Sir Alderton, Miss Pembroke. She read a letter aloud to the table. "I am aware," he said again. The letter she received was a forgery arranged at her instruction by her own solicitor. "I discovered as much an hour ago when I arrived at an office that had not sent for me. The summons to the neighboring county was designed to empty my chair at the table tonight so that the exposure could land without contradiction." He climbed the 1st step. The 2nd. He stopped on the 3rd, one below hers, so that their eyes were level, and she could see the rain caught in the lines of his face, and the set of his jaw, and the way his hand on the banister beside hers was gripping the wood so hard the tendons stood visible across his knuckles. "Come with me," he said. She went with him. He walked through the entrance hall and into the dining room, and Eleanor followed 2 steps behind, and the company sat exactly as she had left them, frozen in the particular arrangement of people who have witnessed a scene and have not yet decided what version of it they will carry home. Lady Ashworth stood by the fireplace with the letter still in her hand and her posture still erect, though something in the angle of her chin had shifted at the sound of her son's boots in the hall. Cecilia Pembroke sat with her hands folded in her lap, her ivory gown catching the candlelight she no longer seemed to want. Mrs. Langford's fan had not moved. Lord Ashworth crossed the room in 4 strides. He did not look at his mother. He did not acknowledge the guests. He looked at Eleanor, who stood in the doorway in her gray dress with her steady hands and the evidence of tears she had not allowed the dining room to see. Then he turned. He faced the table. The silence in the room was absolute, the candle flames the only motion, and when he spoke, his voice was low and level, and carried the authority of a man who had never in his life uttered a word he did not intend to stand behind. "I am marrying Miss Graves. The date stands." 10 words. They landed in the room like the single strike of a church bell in an empty square, and the silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of recognition, the held breath of a company that had finally understood what it had been watching for 3 weeks. Lady Ashworth's hand dropped to her side. The letter slipped from her fingers, turned once in the air, and came to rest on the carpet beside her shoe. Her mouth opened. It closed. She looked at her son's face and saw something there she had not seen in 11 years, something that had been locked since the afternoon William was carried from the lake, and the brother who should have been watching stood at the water's edge with empty hands, and the confidence that had organized her posture since she entered this room folded, and she sat down in the nearest chair with the careful, bewildered slowness of a woman whose certainties have ended in the middle of a sentence she was sure she knew how to finish. Cecilia Pembroke looked up from her plate. Her expression was quiet, and what lived in it was not defeat. It was release. The face of a woman who had been aimed at a target for 2 seasons, and who understood now, watching Lord Ashworth cross that room with Rain still on his shoulders, that she had never been the arrow's true direction. She inclined her head once, briefly, toward Eleanor. Sir Alderton cleared his throat. "I believe," he said, reaching for his glass, "the wedding is still on Sunday." Mrs. Langford's fan resumed its motion. The vicar nodded once and turned to his mother, who was adjusting her cameo with fingers that were not quite steady. And Eleanor stood in the doorway of a room that had attempted to unmake her and watched it rearrange itself around 10 words, and her hand found the door frame, and her breath came back to her in a rush she could not control, and the tears she had held on the staircase fell now, quietly, in front of the candles, and the silver, and the faces of the county, and she did not wipe them away. He found her name that night, not Miss Graves, spoken across drawing rooms for the county's benefit. Not the companion, spoken by his mother for the hierarchy's instruction. He found her name in the corridor outside Lady Fenton's room, where Eleanor had gone to sit with the old woman after the guests departed and the carriages had rolled away into the dark, and when he appeared in the doorway with his coat removed and his cravat still loose, and the rain dried to a faint dampness at his temples, and he saw her sitting there with the blanket drawn over Lady Fenton's knees and the candle burning low on the side table, he said it for the first time. "Eleanor." She looked up. His voice was still low. It was still level. It carried the same authority that had silenced a dining room an hour before. It also carried something she had not heard in it until this moment, a tenderness so controlled it might have passed for formality to anyone who was not listening with her whole self. And Eleanor was listening with her whole self, and she heard it as clearly as if he had crossed the room and placed his hand against her face. "Eleanor," he said again, "come to the fire. You have not eaten since this afternoon." A command, a protection. She rose, and she followed him, and his hand found the small of her back as they turned the corner into the corridor, and the warmth of his palm through the gray fabric of her dress was steady and certain, and said everything his 10 words in the dining room had not had room to hold. The wedding took place on Sunday, the 22nd of December, at St. Michael's, with frost on the windows and the pews filled with the same faces that had sat at the pre-wedding dinner 2 nights before. Lady Ashworth attended. She sat in the front pew in dark blue silk, and her expression, if not yet warm, was no longer the expression of a woman whose certainties were still running. It was the face of a woman who had set a wedding date for the wrong reasons and watched it arrive for the right ones, and who was not yet sure what to do with that knowledge, and who had chosen, for now, to sit quietly with it rather than resist it. Cecilia Pembroke did not attend. She had sent a note that morning, brief and gracious, wishing them well in a hand that did not waver, and it lay on Eleanor's dressing table beside the small leather-bound volume of verse with the pressed violets. On the first morning of the new year, Eleanor sat at the piano in the morning room at Highfield Park. The fire was lit. Snow fell outside the window in thick, slow flakes that caught the pale winter sun and held it for a breath before settling on the stone sill. The book of verse lay open on the side table, and the violets, ash-colored and translucent with age, rested between pages her mother had touched 20 years before. Eleanor played a phrase of something quiet and unfamiliar, stopped, played it again, letting the notes hold in the room before releasing them into the warm air. From the doorway, Lord Ashworth watched her. His hand rested against the frame where he stood, and his shoulder leaned into the wood, and his face, which the county had spent 11 years reading as coldness, held an expression that was not cold at all. It was the expression of a man who had walked into a room and found there the thing he had spent 11 years believing he did not deserve to be trusted with. Eleanor turned on the bench. She saw him. She did not startle, and she did not look away. She held his gaze across the length of the morning room, and the snow fell behind her in the window, and the piano held the last note she had played. And the silence between them was not the silence of a fabrication or a performance, or a corridor that had already decided what it was seeing. It was the silence of a home. The fire shifted once. The snow continued to fall. And Eleanor Graves, who had arrived at Highfield Park with 6 dresses and a mended cloak and a book of her mother's verse, sat at the piano in a room that was hers now, in a house that had finally learned her name. Thank you for staying until the end. If Eleanor's journey moved you, leave a comment with the moment you carried longest.